Hey there, world history students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video on Units 7, 8, and briefly 9, covering the 20th century, because we're not getting to that in class probably. Though it is what we covered most recently in class, I'm going to try to make this video not be too insanely long. And I want to start off by showing you this, Eurocentric timeline, right? So this is a timeline of world history from 1200 to the present from the perspective of a European country. Like, say, Great Britain, for example, or maybe France. Okay, so we start the course off with European countries in the Middle Ages, where they are very much like a sideshow, where the majority of the big stuff that's happening in the world is happening in Dar al-Islam or in Song China. We talk about Southeast Asia, we talk about Africa. Europe is like off on the edges. It's not really doing that much. And the traditional narrative, which, historians problematize, but the traditional story that gets told is that, Europe was very dark and ignorant, and life was short, and there wasn't much education, and feudalism was the form of government, right? And then, around about the 1400s, Europeans began to rediscover ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and the learning that had taken place during those time periods much, much earlier. And this is called the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. So it's like the rebirth of Europe, the beginning of modern Europe, the beginning of Europe starting to rise. And that's when nation states like France and England and Spain and Russia all form. And then, a little bit later in the 1500s, Spain begins to colonize the Americas, discovers a mountain of silver, gets very wealthy. Then later, after 1750, Great Britain starts to industrialize. They start to modernize their economy and their manufacturing, and they start to make a whole lot more money, and there's new inventions and new military inventions. And it's those things that allow Europeans to actually dominate the world. And we can see that in the later half of the 19th century as they colonize Africa and much of Asia. And then we really get to Europe is at its peak at the beginning of the 20th century. It's like the high point for Europe. And very shortly thereafter, we get into a series of global conflicts, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, in which Europe really gets knocked down a few pegs. Europe goes from being the dominant power in the world to not being the dominant power in the world anymore. And a lot of the things that helped Europe to become so powerful and successful sort of spiral out of control in World War I and World War II and led to its undoing. And then as Europe is weakened, we see decolonization in the second half of the 20th century, and then we get to globalization in 2021. And I've put in some helpful dates, which I wish I'd had up on the screen the whole time. But remember, those are the dates you really need to know for this class. Those are the major eras that you need to know. 1945 I threw on there because that's the end of World War II. Okay, so we have talked about 1200 to 1900 in class. This video is to just finish us off with the rest of the course. And there's three topics for this video. There's the global wars, there's Cold War / decolonization, and there's globalization. And Unit 7 starts off with talking about revolutions of the early 20th century. And one that we didn't talk a whole lot about is the Mexican Revolution. This guy's name is Porfirio Diaz, and he was a dictator. So Mexico had a couple of revolutions. They had a revolution that removed the Spanish in the 19th century, but then they entered into this period where they were ruled by a series of corrupt dictators, particularly this guy Porfirio Diaz, who was basically allowing outside interests, particularly from the United States, to really control Mexico and make a lot of money off of Mexico. And so in 1910, Zapata and God, why am I blanking on his name? It's a really famous name. I'm just blanking on it. Anyway, some revolutionaries. Wow, this is really messing with me. I'm a history teacher. I'm supposed to know this. Porfirio Diaz was overthrown in 1910 by Emil Zapata, and wow, I can't remember his name. This is so embarrassing. Um, but the important thing is that this is an example. Mexico was a state that had failed to industrialize and also failed to address inequality, right? So because Porfirio Diaz was corrupt and he was not addressing the inequality that was going on in Mexico, he was overthrown. And by 1920, the new Mexican state had taken hold. A new Mexican state had taken hold of control of Mexico, and that continues to be the state that runs Mexico today. Similarly, the Qing dynasty. Throughout the 19th century, the Qing dynasty failed to industrialize. They were challenged by Europe with the Opium Wars. And there were people who advocated for self-strengthening within Qing China, but that didn't end up going anywhere. So by 1911, the Qing dynasty was overthrown by Sun Yat-sen, who would become the leader of a weakened, fractured China that would then go into civil war in the 1920s, which we'll talk about later what happened after to resolve the Chinese Civil War. And then, of course, there's the Russian Revolution, which happened in 1917. The Tsar was overthrown, and through a convoluted series of events, a communist dictatorship arose under Vladimir Lenin, and then in the 1920s he was replaced by Stalin when he died. Porfirio Diaz got dripped like a broken faucet. I can't remember the name of the guy who overthrew him, but I can remember that he got dripped like a broken faucet. That's great, Mr. Everything. Okay, going on about the same time, we have World War I. And the main thing to know about wars are the causes and the effects, right? The causes and the effects of World War I and World War II are what we should focus on. And the causes of World War I form the helpful acronym MAIN AF. Militarism. So like Germany was a relatively young country that formed in the second half of the 19th century, really upset the European balance of power and caused countries like Great Britain and France to be incredibly worried about Germany. So Great Britain starts building these massive battleships called dreadnoughts. France starts anticipating like what an attack would be like and preparing defenses. This is an example of militarism. Militarism from Great Britain then leads Germany to start like trying to build up its military because it feels threatened. Another thing that happens when people feel threatened is they form alliances. Like Britain and France and Russia all form the Triple Entente. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire form the Central Powers, and they make these alliances with each other with the understanding that if somebody attacks one of the members of this alliance, that the others will come to their defense. Industrialization and imperialism kind of go together. They're both eyes. Imperialism because, Europeans had been competing to colonize the rest of the world, but by 1914, there's really not any more colonies left. There's not really any more places in Africa that can be colonized. There's not really any more places in Southeast Asia that are open to European influence. So the only real way to get more colonies is to take them away from somebody else, like perhaps by fighting them in a war. And then if you beat them, then you can take their colonies. So that becomes like an incentive to fight wars. It also becomes a way that this war becomes very global, right? Because not only is Britain fighting Germany, but British colonies are fighting German colonies. Nationalism is another huge factor. Nationalism, of course, is like, sort of like the ugly side of patriotism, like identifying with your country, having a lot of pride in your country. And all of these countries were sort of defining themselves in opposition to each other, right? Like Great Britain was feeling extra Brittany because extra Brittany, he said. Great Britain was feeling a lot of patriotism because they were in this like militaristic competition with Germany. And then, of course, the thing that we talked about in class that set it off, the AF of it all, if you will, is the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who's killed by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary is outraged and wants to attack Serbia. Russia has Serbia's back and says, don't dare, or we'll attack you too. And suddenly it spirals out of control. The alliances kick in, and suddenly all of the major powers of Europe are at war with each other. Wow, that was a lot of summarizing for one slide. Darn. So what are the effects? Well, The Treaty of Versailles. Why was the Treaty of Versailles hot garbage? Wow, I really killed it with this slideshow. Um, the thing about the Treaty of Versailles is that it made anybody who wasn't the United States, Britain, or France, who were the people who drew up the Treaty of Versailles, it made everybody else incredibly angry, right? Like you all know very well, I think, because I read your essays on this, that the Treaty of Versailles really angered Germany because it was incredibly harsh. Blamed Germany for World War One. Said that Germany, which is not true, like Germany is not solely to blame for World War One. Like that's a very reductive, overly simplistic explanation of World War One. But nevertheless, Britain and France, particularly France, really wanted Germany to accept full blame. They wanted Germany to give up all kinds of colonies and land. They wanted to put severe limits on the size of the German military, and they made Germany pay huge amounts of money that it couldn't afford to Britain and France. And at the same time, it angered people who weren't Germany. It angered non-European countries because Woodrow Wilson, who's sitting there saying he liked it though, came out with this idea of self-determination in his 14 points, where he said that if you have a nation of people, they should have a state. If you have a nation of people who are living in one particular place, that they should have a state there. They should have a government that runs their, they should have their own country. And he was specifically, I think, meaning only places in Eastern Europe that had formerly been parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was thinking of Czechoslovakia. He was thinking of Poland. He was not thinking of India. And the thing about it is Britain had no interest in giving India independence, but India had contributed huge amounts of men and material, had contributed to the effort to defeat Germany with the understanding that they would get some sort of self-rule once the war was over. And then it was like, nope, you don't. Japan was present at the Paris Peace Conference, and they thought that they were going to get treated with some kind of respect as a new modern industrialized power. They didn't. They were disrespected. The people of the former Ottoman Empire who wanted to have self-rule, like in Iraq and Syria and Palestine, they all thought they were going to get some kind of measure of independence, but France and Britain had already sort of carved up the Middle East under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, creating the mandate system where, basically most of the Middle East continued to be colonies of Britain and France. So nobody was happy, and that is why the Treaty of Versailles was hot garbage. So as I was just saying, these tensions really increased after World War II. The mandate system, I basically just talked about this slide without realizing it was coming up. Gandhi was the nationalist leader of India who was trying to gain some independence for India. This is when Gandhi's civil disobedience really kicks in, and he does the Salt March because Britain is charging a tax on salt, and Gandhi says that's ridiculous and leads a long march to the sea where he makes salt in the Indian Ocean. And then the homespun movement, where there's a boycott on British textiles and people in India began making their own cloth. Other tensions that existed after World War I are economic in nature. And I want you to understand, okay, some misunderstandings came out in your essays. World War I did not cause the Great Depression. World War I caused severe economic problems for Germany in the 1920s. Everybody else after World War I mean, Britain and France had to rebuild, but particularly in the United States, it was a period of prosperity. Germany was really struggling, though, and Germany had massive inflation, as you all noted, and the German people were incredibly unhappy and were looking for leadership to help them, rebuild their economy. The Great Depression doesn't kick in until 1929. In 1929, the U.S. economy craters because of globalization and the way that economies are connected internationally. It leads to economic crises around the world. It's a global depression. And different governments respond in different ways. In the United States, the response is the New Deal. The government takes on more of an interest in Keynesian economics, or allowing the government to intervene and try to create jobs through creating work programs like the WPA. That's the New Deal. In the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, the economy is run completely by the government. It's a command economy the government is a communist dictatorship where the government controls things. And so Stalin has these 5-year plans where he's trying to rapidly industrialize the economy, where he's taking food from, rural areas like Ukraine and sending it to urban centers, and then the people of Ukraine are starving to death in mass numbers, like somewhere between 3 and 10 million people. And then in Germany, you have fascist corporate economies where they're still capitalism, but the government is heavily involved in working with businesses to try to create what it is they want. And Germany really starts to rebound as Hitler takes over Germany in the early 1930s, I think it's 33, and starts to remilitarize Germany. So they start spending lots of money getting ready to fight a war, and that money is what gets the German economy going again and creates wealth and prosperity. And at the time, people in America were looking at Germany going, wow, how did Germany turn around so fast? Not fully realizing that they turned around so fast because Hitler was illegally building tanks and fighter planes and bomber planes and other things. So the effects of World War I are really the causes of World War II, right? And I think you all got that. Germany was incredibly unhappy. Japan was incredibly unhappy after World War I. They start pursuing aggressive policies of expansion. Germany, as you know, was expanded into the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. They wanted that land because they said there were German people living there. They wanted land from Poland. Hitler talked about Lebensraum, or living space, wanting to have enough land that Germany could be self-sufficient. We talked about the idea of autarky, like a government that wants to be self-sufficient and not have to trade with other people to get what it needs. Similarly, Japan, which had felt disrespected at the Paris Peace Conferences, wanted more natural resources for its new industrialized economy, and it started looking at places in the Pacific Ocean to try to get those things. The United States was also interested in expanding into the Pacific. They had already acquired Hawaii and the Philippines and Guam and other places. And so the United States and Japan are expanding into the same territory, and that causes them to come into conflict with each other. Japan invades China, takes over Manchuria and names it Manchukuo, which is becomes a Japanese colony in northern China. Then they take over parts of Indochina, which is, the French colony that would become Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So that's aggression, right? We have states that are aggressively expanding, trying to take over natural resources. Then there's appeasement. England and France and the United States were not interested, particularly England and France, were not interested in fighting another world war. And the lesson of World War I in many ways was hey, you got to be a little flexible. You can't just draw a line in the sand and say, if you attack Serbia, then we're all going to fight, right? That was what happened in World War I. People were rigid, they didn't compromise, and it led to an incredibly costly war. So when Germany starts making all this noise about how it wants to expand and take over things and how the Treaty of Versailles wasn't fair and they're undoing it, England and France are okay, well, last time we were super not willing to compromise, and that led to a war, so we're going to work with you on this one. And they had a conference, the Munich Conference in 1938, where England and France basically said to Germany, okay, you want to take over this part of Czechoslovakia. Do you promise that that's the last thing you're going to do? You're not going to expand anymore. And Hitler was yep, that's it. That's the only thing I need. And so they signed this document. And England and France really thought that they had secured peace, that they had avoided a war by being reasonable and compromising and giving Germany what they want. Of course, less than a year later, Germany invades Poland. So that's appeasement, right? And it's a really tricky question. It's very easy for people in 2021 to look, or 2022, my God, to look back at this decision of appeasement and be wow, England and France were so weak and ridiculous. I can't believe that they let Hitler get away with that. But they were working with the lesson that they had just learned 20 years previously, which was that you need to be a little bit flexible and compromise with people. So appeasement and aggression are the causes of World War II. Apologies if I have a brain fart and I say World War I instead of World War II or vice versa at some point. After World War II is over, our next global conflict is the Cold War. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Cold War, but we know that it's an ideological conflict where the United States believes in democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union believes in communism. The United States is really focused on liberty, right? Like focusing on individuals' rights to make choices for themselves. The Soviet Union is very focused on justice, the idea that like the government needs to run the economy in order to make sure that everybody gets access to the things that they should have a right to have. Also, the Soviet Union is super corrupt and a dictatorship. But like, if you're going to look at the ideology, like the ideology is that communism is trying to provide everybody with the things that they need in a way that they believe capitalism doesn't. So the United States and the Soviet Union both have these ideologies. Each ideology seeks to basically take over the world. Like the United States wants every country in the world to be a democratic capitalist society. The Soviet Union wants every country in the world to be a communist society. And those two things are in conflict with each other. And so after World War II, Europe breaks in half. We end up with Western Europe that is part of NATO and sides with the United States. We got Eastern Europe, which becomes Soviet satellite states, which means basically like puppets of the Soviet Union. And they form the Warsaw Pact with the Soviet Union. Later, China becomes a communist country in 1949 under Mao. And, you know, while they're not completely lined up with the Soviet Union, they do tend to side with them as a fellow communist country. And then what we talked about was that against this backdrop, in the Northern Hemisphere, we've got the Cold War going on. And then suddenly, after World War II, all of these new countries are gaining independence. Colonization is ending because the European powers aren't powerful enough to keep it going anymore because of World War II. And so like countries like Ghana and Vietnam and India and Angola and Congo and Cuba are starting to get their independence, and they're starting to try to decide what kind of government they want to have. And they're facing a lot of pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union to try to join one side or the other. And so a lot of the Cold War is about new countries being sucked into the ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the extremes, this turns into a series of proxy wars, like in Afghanistan and Korea and Angola and Vietnam. Like those are all proxy wars where one side or both is being funded by either the United States and the Soviet Union or the Soviet Union, and they're fighting. Basically, the United States and Soviet Union are fighting each other through this third party. And then you have a lot of countries that are forming what they call the non-aligned movement, which are countries that say, like, we are not going to take a side in this thing. We are staying out of it. And so, like, good examples of that are India, Indonesia, and Ghana. As countries start to gain independence, there's like two different ways, really. There's the negotiated independence, which is what Ghana did, which is what India did, where you sit down with the colonizer and you like make a deal and you work out like the plan for how you're going to get independence. And then there's independence that happens through war. And the example we focused on the most in class is Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh, who was the communist leader of North Vietnam. And then also there's the example of Algeria in West Africa, which was a French colony, and France didn't want to let go of Vietnam, and they didn't want to let go of Algeria. And there were, you know, wars of independence there that were fought in order to get their freedom. And then you need to know that there are religious nationalist groups, and a really good example of this is the Muslim League in India. The All-Muslim League was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and you know, Islam, remember, is the minority religion in India. About 80% of the country is Hindu. About 20% of the country was Muslim. And so after they got their independence in 1947, Jinnah, the leader of the All-Muslim League, All India Muslim League, advocated. He was worried that he and other Muslims were worried that Muslims wouldn't have a voice in the new Indian government. And so they advocated for partition. They wanted to have a Muslim country, which became West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Later, East Pakistan would change its name and become a new country called Bangladesh. The problem here was that, you know, when you're drawing new borders, a lot of times in this time period, there's going to be a lot of violence. And as people who were living in as Muslims who lived in India were migrating to Pakistan, and as Hindus who lived in Pakistan were migrating to India, there became all kinds of violence and atrocities, rapes, and murders were committed on both sides against people who were had religious differences. It was, it was ugly. And have much more to say about it. Migration from former colonies to metropoles. You need to know that in places that were formerly colonized, a lot of times people would leave and go to the former colonizer in order to have more opportunities. So that includes India. Lots of people from South Asia left South Asia and moved to Britain in order to get jobs. A lot of Algerians left Africa and moved to France in order to get jobs. Filipinos leaving the Philippines and going to the United States. Oh, we don't need to worry about that. And then finally, briefly, Unit 9 is all about how new technology changes the world. Hey, I can talk to you later. Sorry, got interrupted. New technology is going to lead to faster communication, which is going to faster communication and transportation, which are going to create globalization. Because people can now talk over greater distances and they can move over greater distances much faster, it means that the world is going to feel smaller and that companies are going to be able to have global markets where they're getting natural resources from everywhere in the world, and then they're selling the products they make with them to everyone in the world. And the iPhone is a great example of that. It's got natural resources coming from Central Africa. It's being manufactured in China, and then it's being sold all over the world. And that's all made possible by new technology. You need to know about the Green Revolution, which started in the mid-20th century, where developed nations like the United States, working through the United Nations, the UN, tried to put in place policies that would create, that would bring new agricultural techniques to developing countries, specifically Mexico and India. And these countries would then use these new agricultural technologies to grow more food and be able to feed more people. And it's been controversial, like the extent to which that did or did not work. And then we've also seen the rise of global culture, where like everybody in the world now is able to watch soccer games in Europe, and frequently those soccer games are being played by people from all over the world, not just Europeans. Also, K-pop, like the fact that I have students writing BTS on my board is another sign of global culture. Yeah, global culture. It's smooth like butter, like a criminal undercover. I don't know the next line. That's it. That's what I got. I know that's like a kind of a quick it's a quick overview, but I think that is enough for now. I don't want to overwhelm you in the couple days before the AP exam. Let me know if you need anything. If you have questions, shoot me an email. And I know I'm not always great about it. I'm gonna try to answer it. Okay, all right, I'm gonna shut up now. Bye.